Cold October rain pelted my face as two security guards gripped my elbows, marching me across the slick asphalt parking lot like a common thief. Through the double-pane glass walls of the third-floor break room, I could see my former colleagues raising crystal flutes of cheap champagne, laughing around her. Audrey Miller, with her perfect posture, expensive dark blazer, and brand-new business degree from a prestigious university, stood under a bundle of colorful balloons that bobbed against the ceiling tiles. My personal belongings, accumulated over 3 years of late nights, skipped lunches, and weekends spent staring at glowing monitors, sat in a soggy cardboard box balanced precariously under my right arm. I caught the eye of Julian Pierce, my manager of 3 years, as he lifted his glass higher in a theatrical toast to his new star hire. Even through the rain-streaked glass and the gathering dusk, I could read his lips as he smiled and looked toward his colleagues. "She will fix your mess." Those words cut deeper than the cold wind that swept through the parking lot. For 3 years, which is exactly 1,095 days of constant work, I had served as the lead traffic systems architect at Vanguard Systems. I had coded, analyzed, and optimized the dynamic traffic grid controller that managed emergency vehicle routing and public transit flow for a city of 2 million people. "We are pursuing alternative methodologies," Julian had announced 30 minutes earlier, sliding an empty cardboard box across his polished glass desk. Someone with more conventional credentials. I did not raise my voice, did not plead for my job, and did not explain that my dynamic algorithms were the only thing keeping the city roads from collapsing into gridlock. I just packed my mechanical keyboard, my notebooks, and my coffee mug, feeling something vital inside me harden like concrete. The security guard, a man named Dennis who had smiled and greeted me every morning at the lobby desk, kept his eyes fixed on the wet asphalt as he ushered me to the double doors of the exit. "Just protocol, Stuart," he muttered under his breath, sounding embarrassed by his own role in this performance. I tossed the wet cardboard box into the passenger seat of my 10-year-old sedan and sat behind the steering wheel, watching the lights of the office building blur through my rain-lashed windshield. They had been grooming Audrey for months, bringing her into my design reviews to question my architecture, asking why we could not just use off-the-shelf routing packages. Conventional approaches, she had called them during our meetings. But conventional approaches did not account for the chaotic reality of a metropolitan grid under stress. My name is Stuart Campbell, and at 54 years old, I was about to teach Vanguard Systems a lesson about the real cost of corporate arrogance. I started the engine, listening to it sputter in the damp air. The highway stretched before me, a long line of red taillights crawling through the storm. I knew every bottleneck, every timing cycle, every sub-second delay on that road. I had spent the last 3 years translating my 25 years of infrastructure experience into the digital veins of this city, and now they believed a fresh graduate could manage it with a simple checklist. I drove home slowly, feeling the weight of the rejection settle into my bones. 3 years of my life, gone in a single afternoon. I had skipped my sister's wedding, missed holiday dinners with my family in Ohio, and ignored my own deteriorating health to ensure the city's traffic flowed smoothly. My apartment was quiet and dark when I walked in. I set my soggy cardboard box on the kitchen counter, my hands shaking slightly. I looked at the notebooks filled with my handwritten equations, diagrams of intersection throughput, and designs for database query optimization. These were not just notes. They were the blueprint of my mind, the culmination of decades of technical dedication. I had built Vanguard Systems' entire traffic optimization division from scratch. And now I was being discarded because they wanted to replace my practical expertise with a cheaper, credentialed alternative. I sat on my sofa, staring at the dark window, listening to the rain beat against the glass. The city lights flickered in the distance, a vast network of movement that I understood better than anyone else. I knew the system would not survive without my guidance. The baseline configurations I had established would keep things running for a short time. But the first major traffic event or weather anomaly would overwhelm the static parameters. They believed they had bought a complete, self-sustaining product, but they had actually bought a living system that required constant attention. I fell asleep on the couch, my mind spinning with calculations, feeling a cold determination settle over me. If they wanted conventional approaches, I would let them experience the results of conventional management. I thought back to the early days when the city grid was plagued by daily multi-hour bottlenecks. The city was losing millions in economic productivity, and the emergency response times were a disaster. I had spent months riding along with ambulance crews, studying their dispatch logs and analyzing the telemetry from thousands of municipal vehicles. I had identified the micro-patterns that no simulation could capture, the subtle human variables that standard traffic models ignored. I had built an adaptive system that adjusted signal phases in real time, reacting to events before they could cause gridlock. My system worked because I had poured my intuition and my experience into every single line of code. And now, they believe that some generic graduate with an MBA could manage this complex web of human activity using basic queuing models she had read about in a textbook. It was a delusion, and I knew that reality would shatter it very soon. The first 24 hours of my freedom were completely silent. I spent the day walking through the local park, reading books I had bought months ago but never had time to open, and making real meals in my kitchen instead of eating takeout at my desk. The traffic system, which I had named Apex Flow, was still running on the baseline parameters I had optimized over the last year. But by the second morning, the silence was broken. My phone vibrated against the wooden dining table. Audrey Miller was calling. I watched the screen light up, ring to its limit, and go dark. 3 minutes later, the phone buzzed again, then again. By noon, I had counted 8 missed calls. By 5 p.m., the count had reached 15. At midnight, as I sat reading an old engineering journal, the 19th call came through. I did not answer. The system was designed to handle average conditions on autopilot, but it required continuous active adjustments to balance the load between the industrial and commercial sectors. Without my regular tuning, the connection pools on the primary database would begin to exhaust. The next morning, my phone buzzed with a message from Clara Fletcher, the only junior engineer who had survived Julian Pierce's recent cost-cutting measures. "Stuart, please answer," Clara wrote. "The entire North Quadrant is completely locked up. Emergency dispatch had to call in helicopters for 3 accidents on Interstate 95 because ambulances are stuck in traffic. Audrey tried to reset the connection parameters using standard database settings, and now the main routing service is throwing fatal errors. Julian is losing his mind, and the mayor's office is threatening to cancel our contract." I stared at the text. Real people were sitting in gridlock, and emergency vehicles were blocked. It was a disaster, but it was a disaster that Julian and Audrey had engineered. An hour later, my doorbell rang. Julian Pierce stood on my welcome mat. His expensive wool suit was wrinkled, his silver hair was disheveled, and dark circles shadowed his bloodshot eyes. "Stuart, we need to talk," he said, trying to force a friendly smile that looked more like a grimace. "May I come in?" I stood in the doorway, blocking his path. "Why would you want to talk to me, Julian? I am just the man whose work you called a mess." He winced, looking down at his polished shoes. "That was a misunderstanding. We were under pressure from the board. The implementation is failing, and Audrey is encountering some system anomalies. We are prepared to offer you a temporary consulting contract at 3 times your previous rate. Just help us stabilize the system for 48 hours. I looked at the man who had stood by while security marched me out like a criminal. "No, Julian. The contract is yours, and Audrey has the conventional credentials you wanted. Let her fix it." I closed the door, shutting out his pleas. I walked back to my kitchen and poured a fresh cup of coffee, feeling the silence of my apartment return. I knew exactly what was happening in the server room. Audrey had likely attempted to implement a standard round-robin routing algorithm to clear the congestion in the North Quadrant. But that quadrant had a unique layout, with narrow streets and heavy pedestrian traffic from the University District. Standard algorithms would only redirect traffic into bottlenecks, creating a secondary gridlock that would eventually cascade through the entire city. It was the classic mistake of someone who understood the theory of queuing but had never stood on a street corner watching how people actually drive. My phone continued to vibrate on the table, a steady stream of notifications that I ignored. I felt a pang of sympathy for Clara, who was likely working 18-hour shifts trying to hold the system together, but I knew I could not step in yet. If I went back now, Julian would simply claim the crisis was a minor technical glitch and continue his plan to phase out senior technical roles. The company needed to understand the true value of my expertise, and that understanding could only come through the direct experience of failure. I spent the afternoon organizing my files, preparing for the next phase of my plan. I knew the mayor would get involved soon, and I wanted to be ready when she did. I watched the local news channels on my television. The reports were becoming increasingly grim. The city was experiencing what the commentators were calling the gridlock crisis. The average commute time had increased by 40%, and the Municipal Transit Authority was reporting losses of over $100,000 per hour. Local business owners were complaining about delivery delays, and the public was becoming furious. The mayor had held a press conference, demanding answers from Vanguard Systems. Julian was running out of time, and he knew that his career was on the line. But I remained calm, knowing that the legal parameters of the situation were entirely in my favor. I had protected my intellectual property, and I was prepared to enforce my rights in court if necessary. Julian had treated my engineering work as a simple commodity, but he was about to find out that without the proper licenses and expertise, that commodity was useless to him. I spent the evening drafting a formal letter to the board, detailing the licensing violations and the breach of contract. I was not going to let them escape the consequences of their actions. What Julian Pierce did not know was that I had already anticipated this outcome. I was not just an employee, I was the original developer of the core adaptive routing module. I had created it before joining Vanguard Systems, registering the source code with the United States Copyright Office under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. I also held a utility patent on the dynamic traffic state estimation method under 35 U.S.C. Section 271. When I joined the company 3 years ago, I signed a limited licensing agreement. The agreement clearly stated that the company was granted a non-exclusive license to use my proprietary engine, contingent upon my active employment as chief architect to supervise its integration. If my employment was terminated without cause, the license would automatically terminate in 30 days unless Vanguard Systems paid a licensing buyout fee of $5,000. To bypass this clause, Julian had attempted a desperate corporate maneuver. 6 months ago, during a routine system update, he had presented me with a bundle of digital forms to sign. Hidden among them was a document that purported to assign all my intellectual property rights to Vanguard Systems for a nominal payment of $1. I had refused to sign it. But when the crisis hit, Julian went into the company archive and uploaded a version of the assignment document with a scanned, forged copy of my signature. This forgery was a clear violation of California Penal Code Section 470. Under the law, a contract executed through forgery is void ab initio, meaning it is invalid from the very beginning. That afternoon, I met with Mayor Evelyn Vance at a small coffee shop near City Hall. I presented her with my original copyright registration under 17 U.S.C. Section 106, my patent documentation under 35 U.S.C. Section 271, and a copy of the original employment contract. The city's legal counsel sat beside her, his face turning pale as he reviewed the papers. If Vanguard Systems does not own this code, the lawyer said, then the city is currently running unlicensed software on public infrastructure. We are exposing ourselves to federal infringement damages of up to $150,000 per day. Exactly, I said. And since Vanguard Systems fired me, they are in material breach of their city contract because they cannot deliver a legal, functional system. The mayor looked up, her expression hardening. Then we terminate their contract for cause, and we contract with you directly as an independent municipal consultant. I sat back, watching the mayor discuss the details with her legal team. I had spent years protecting Vanguard Systems from their own mistakes, but this time, they had crossed a legal line that could not be ignored. Julian's forgery was not just a violation of my trust, it was a criminal act that exposed the entire company to liquidation. The city's lawyer explained that under the Warren Act, 29 U.S.C., Section 2101, Vanguard Systems was also facing penalties for failing to provide proper notice before laying off my entire support team last month. They had tried to cut costs by ignoring the law, and now those legal liabilities were piling up like cars in the North Quadrant. The mayor took a slow sip of her coffee, her eyes focused on the documents. "Stewart, we need this system running," she said. "The city cannot afford another day of gridlock. I can authorize an emergency contract for your services. We will bypass Vanguard systems entirely, citing their material breach of contract and the fraudulent nature of their licensing representation. You will have full authority over the traffic grid, and we will handle the legal fallout with their board." I agreed, feeling a sense of relief. The fight was no longer about my pride. It was about protecting the city and ensuring that the work of my life was managed by people who respected both the technology and the law. I explained to the mayor that my copyright under 17 U.S.C. Section 106 covered the unique source code structure, the sequence of operations, and the specific database interaction routines. Vanguard systems had no right to copy, distribute, or modify that code without my active consent. The patent under 35 U.S.C. Section 271 protected the method of estimating real-time traffic density using sparse sensor data. Even if they tried to rewrite the code, they would still infringe on my patent if they used my method. The city's lawyer agreed that our case was airtight. He noted that under California Penal Code Section 470, the forgery of my signature on the IP transfer document carried serious criminal penalties. The district attorney's office would be very interested in reviewing the digital forensics. We were not just preparing a civil lawsuit, we were preparing a criminal referral that would destroy Julian Pierce's professional standing forever. At 10:00 a.m. the next morning, I walked into the main branch of the public library, heading to the third-floor study rooms. Audrey Miller was already sitting there, her laptop open, surrounded by printed system logs. She looked exhausted, her face pale, and her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "I did not sit down. I am only here because Clara told me the ambulances still cannot clear the intersection on 5th Avenue. Audrey closed her laptop with a sigh. "I do not understand why the system is behaving this way. I applied the standard queuing models I learned in my graduate program. The traffic density should distribute evenly across the secondary routes. But instead, the vehicles are clustering and the signals are locking up. Your textbook models assume that drivers behave like rational, mathematical points," I explained, looking down at her screen. "They do not. Drivers in this city are adaptive. They watch the weather, they watch the construction signs, and they change their behavior based on local patterns. My architecture does not impose rigid rules. It measures real-time density and adapts the signal intervals organically. You tried to force a mechanical template onto a living system." Audrey stared at her logs, then looked up at me. "Julian told me your documentation was incomplete, that you had hidden the configuration keys." I opened my notebook and showed her a printout of the database schema. "The documentation is complete, Audrey. You just did not understand what you were reading because you have never managed a real city grid under stress. You wanted my job, and now you have it." She lowered her head. "I was wrong, Stewart. I did not know Julian was going to forge your signature on the IP transfer. Clara told me about the audit logs. I did not want to steal your work. I just wanted to build a career. If you want to save your career, you need to tell the truth," I said. "There is an emergency board meeting tomorrow morning at Vanguard Systems. Julian is going to blame my code for the gridlock. If you stand up and present the audit logs showing the forged signature, you might protect yourself from the legal fallout of California Penal Code Section 470. If you do not, you will be dragged down with him." Audrey looked at the pen in her hand, her jaw tightening. "I will do it," she whispered. "I will tell them the truth." I watched her for a moment, seeing the realization of what she had done sink in. She had been used as a pawn by Julian to justify his cost-cutting measures, and now she was staring at the wreckage of both the city's traffic and her own professional reputation. She had believed that a prestigious degree would protect her from the realities of engineering, but the system had shown no mercy to her theories. I showed her the specific lines of code that were failing. The connection pools were overflowing because her standard configuration was not releasing the database sessions fast enough during times. I explained that she needed to clear the active queues manually, but warned her that doing so without my proprietary license would constitute a direct infringement under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. She nodded, understanding the legal trap Julian had walked the company into. She agreed to testify at the board meeting, knowing it was her only chance to avoid being named as a co-conspirator in the forgery. We walked out of the library together, the rain finally stopping, leaving the streets wet and reflecting the gray sky. I felt a sense of clarity. The pieces were all in place, and the final confrontation was only a day away. I spent the rest of the evening preparing my presentation for the board. I compiled the audit logs, the system metrics, and the legal documentation. I wanted to make sure that the board members understood that the failure of the system was not a technical problem, but a management failure. Julian had tried to treat my work as a commodity that could be managed by anyone, but the reality of the gridlock had shown them that without my active guidance, the system was useless. I was going to show them that engineering is not just about writing code. It is about understanding the complex relationships between technology, human behavior, and the law. I was prepared to show them the truth, and I knew that truth would set me free while binding Julian to his own mistakes. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 10:09 a.m. at Vanguard Systems headquarters. I arrived at 9:45 a.m., wearing the charcoal gray suit I reserved for formal presentations. I walked past the front desk, the receptionist looking up in surprise, but failing to stop me as I headed to the executive elevator. The boardroom was filled with tense energy. Julian Pierce stood at the head of the long mahogany table, projecting a slide that showed a red dashboard with the heading Experimental Code Failures. Audrey Miller sat to his right, her hands folded in her lap. I stood in the doorway, waiting. Julian paused mid-sentence, his face flushing red as he saw me. "Stuart, this is a private meeting," he barked. "Security, escort this man out." Before he could call the desk, the door behind me opened, and Mayor Evelyn Vance walked in, flanked by her legal counsel and 2 investigators from the district attorney's office. "This meeting is now under municipal review," the mayor announced, her voice echoing in the silent room. The board chairman stood up in shock. "Mayor Vance, what is the meaning of this? Your manager, Julian Pierce, has committed material contract breach," the mayor's attorney stated, placing a thick folder on the table. "He is also engaged in digital forgery under California Penal Code Section 470 to claim ownership of Stuart Campbell's intellectual property, which is protected under 17 U.S.C. Section 106. Julian sputtered, pointing at Audrey. "That is absurd. We have a signed transfer agreement." Audrey Miller stood up, her voice steady. "The signature on that agreement was forged," she said, looking directly at the board members. "I checked the system logs from the compliance archive. Julian uploaded the document using an administrative override 3 days ago. Here is the cryptographic log showing the backdated timestamp." She slid a USB drive across the table. The boardroom erupted into shouting. The board chairman looked at the investigators, then at Julian, whose face had turned a pale, sickly green. "We are terminating our contract with Vanguard Systems effective immediately," Mayor Vance said, "and we are hiring Stuart Campbell to deploy as proprietary traffic controller under a direct municipal contract." 48 hours later, I was back in the control center, with Clara Fletcher sitting to my right. With 3 keystrokes, I cleared the database connection pools and restored the adaptive parameters of the Apex flow system. The red indicators on the city map slowly turned to green. Within 1 hour, the average commute time dropped by 30%, and ambulances were moving freely through the streets once more. 1 month later, Vanguard Systems filed for bankruptcy after losing their primary municipal contract and facing a federal copyright infringement lawsuit. Julian Pierce was indicted for forgery, his career ruined. True revenge is not about breaking things. It is about building a system that stands strong long after the people who tried to tear you down are gone. I walked past the empty Vanguard building a few weeks later, seeing the lease signs in the windows. Julian's empire had crumbled because he believed that code was just a commodity and that the people who built it could be discarded without consequence. But infrastructure does not lie. It demands respect, and it demands expertise. I was now the director of the city's new municipal transportation division, and my team was composed of engineers who understood the value of practical knowledge. We were building a new system, one that would serve the city for decades, protected by the very laws that Julian had tried to ignore. True revenge was not just watching Julian face the court. It was knowing that my creation was finally in safe hands, helping millions of people get home safely every single day. The new division was established in a bright modern office on the 5th floor of City Hall. I had hired Clara Fletcher as the lead infrastructure engineer, and we had brought on 3 other former Vanguard engineers who had been laid off during Julian's cost-cutting phase. We were no longer working under the pressure of quarterly corporate profits. We were working for the public good, focused on building reliable, open, and legally compliant systems. The mayor had secured a budget of $2 million for our first year, which was more than enough to implement our new, improved routing models. My patents were now properly licensed to the city, ensuring that my rights were respected and that I received fair compensation for my innovations. I sat in my new office, looking out at the city streets below. The traffic flowed smoothly, the signals changing in response to the dynamic patterns of movement. I felt a sense of peace that I had not felt in years. The struggle had been difficult, but the outcome had vindicated my belief in the importance of expertise, integrity, and the rule of law. The people who had tried to marginalize me were gone, and the system I had built was still here, moving the city forward.